Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Mariam Pira. I am the coordinator for our local Weal group here in Chicago, which is a partnership with Weal magazine. We've got some of our colleagues from the magazine on the call. Joining us today is Susan Reynolds. Susan is an assistant professor of Catholic Studies at Candler? Am I saying that accurately? Thank you. Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta. We're very excited to have Susan on board with us. I'm hungry. I'm hungry too. I know it's dinner time. So I'm going to be handing off to my colleague in a minute to do a proper introduction of Susan. Before we start in earnest, in addition to welcoming you all, I had a couple of sort of housekeeping rules for the call. One, if you wouldn't mind, please muting your microphone during the presentation, just so that we're not getting feedback or bounce backs of sound. There will be time for Q&A certainly throughout the session, so we'll look forward to your participation. If you have any posts or links or quotes that you would like to share or thoughts that you don't want to forget as Susan is speaking, please feel free to share those in the chat box. We love having that sort of engagement. And then also, if you're able, please turn on your video when you're speaking, just so that it's a little easier to engage in the platform when we're able to see one another. And with that, I will hand off to Gabriella.
Thanks, Miriam. I'm Gabriella. I work at Weal magazine, which is a co-host for tonight's event. We're a lay publication centered on religion, politics, and culture. I'm very excited to introduce to you tonight Susan Reynolds, who is a Catholic theologian whose work examines the intersection of ecclesiology and lived Catholicism in context of diversity, marginality, and suffering. It's so wonderful to have Susan here with us. She's written a couple pieces for Weal, one dating as early back into the spring, where we did a huge special issue dedicated to the state of the American parish. This was right before we all kind of hunkered down in the world that is now the pandemic reality. But Susan's piece was specifically focused on the changes and transformations that we were already seeing in the American parish, especially related to geography and the movements that are happening within the church. Since then, we've also done an event with Susan to talk a bit about how the pandemic has changed the reality of parish. And most recently, she wrote a piece for us talking about Fratelli Tutti with kind of a soundtrack analysis to it. So tonight we invited Susan back to be here for tonight's conversation to help us think a little bit more using kind of that spring article talking about the changes and transformations in parish life to kind of be a grounding or an anchor for tonight's conversation to think about spiritual resilience, parish life, and kind of the upcoming holiday season that we have ahead. So with all of those things in mind, I now turn it over to Susan.
Thanks, everybody. It's really such an honor to be with you all this evening. I'm grateful for the invitation, and I really hope that this can be a conversation and not just me speaking. It's funny to think back now on on the parish issue, and I know that the link to the April article was sent around because the entire issue was written just on the brink of the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. And so by the time the issue arrived in people's mailbox, everyone had already been quarantining for like 2 or 3 weeks. So even though the issue tackles some really deeply important realities, a couple of which I name in the article that I wrote and in the pieces by others, issues of race and disability and cultural pluralism, among others in our parishes, by the time it hit the presses in people's mailboxes, it already seemed somewhat like adjacent to the big questions that everybody was asking. And so in the piece that I wrote, and that maybe some of you had a chance to glance at, and if not, that's perfectly fine. I talk about a few sources of transformation in the Catholic parish, US Catholic parish today: demographic transformation, geographical transformation, and transformation in sort of our models or conceptions of parish life. And most likely in your parishes, especially in Chicago, you're actually the epicenter of a lot of these transformations. We all know about the profound demographic transformation affecting US parishes and US Catholicism in general. In the US Catholic Church today, probably upwards of 40% of Catholics are Latino. A quarter of US Catholics were born outside of the country, which making them first generation immigrants. Well over 50% of Catholics who are sort of millennials and younger are Latinx. Asian American Catholics, Native American Catholics, African American Catholics are the groups that are in many ways responsible for the continued viability of the US Catholic Church. So there's profound demographic transformation going on in parishes right now. There's also geographic transformation underway. So whereas, of course, in Chicago, you all know this too well, these sort of once and former epicenters of US Catholic life, these urban centers where there's 15 parishes on every city block, Chicago and, South Bend, Indiana, and Boston and New York and Philadelphia, places like that. Today, right, we're seeing those parishes close. We're seeing Catholic schools close because there's too much infrastructure and not enough mass going Catholics. Whereas here in the South, I live in Atlanta, Georgia, the population of the archdiocese has doubled and doubled and doubled again over the past 20 years or so. They can't build parishes fast enough. So in the area of the country where we're seeing the most Catholic expansion, we don't have the kind of Catholic infrastructure. We don't have enough parishes. We have very few Catholic universities and colleges. So I teach at a Methodist seminary. I teach at Candler School of Theology, which is a Methodist UMC seminary. But they started a couple of years ago a Catholic studies program because there were really almost no institutions of higher ed serving Catholic graduate students specifically in this part of the country. So it was a real opportunity to say to lay Catholics who live in and around the Atlanta area, hey, we're here for you. So that's a big transformation. And then, of course, transformations in our understanding of parish life. So, 100 years ago, if you had the kind of immigration that we're seeing today, what you would get in many places, not everywhere, are a profusion of national and ethnic specific parishes. So again, in Chicago, you have your St. Hedwig's and you have your St. Anthony's and your Polish parish and your Italian parish and your this parish and Lithuanian parish. And my whole family is from a tiny Slovak parish in Streator, Illinois, which is proudly the first Slovak parish in America. Today, you have this growing model of what Brett Hoover calls shared parishes. So 2, 3, 4, sometimes more cultural or linguistic communities sharing a single parish space, kind of orbiting around each other, not really knowing what to do with one another, not really knowing what it means to call ourselves a parish community when you have essentially a parish of communities, a community of communities. So these are some radical changes that are transforming the parish today. And yet, by the time the April 2020 issue hit the mailboxes, it was already like, okay, and what's next, right? What in the world do we do now? How will the pandemic change parish life? How is the pandemic changing the church? Put another way, I guess, if I were going to rewrite the article today, what would I add? I think first and foremost, I would factor in the impact of disruption on parish life. Studies of the decline of Catholic religious practice in the post-Vatican II era have suggested in so many words and ways that essentially interruption leads to decline. So in other words, once you sort of introduce choice into people's Catholic practice, the idea that you don't necessarily need to go to your geographical parish, or the idea that the magisterium gets things wrong sometimes, as we saw in 1968 with the birth control debate, right? The idea that, even the way in which the Second Vatican Council was publicized, right? This was the first time that a church gathering of that scale and magnitude had been reported like in the media. So people saw these micro deliberations going on, not as like God handing down from the sky a new set of, here's, doctrine with a capital D. These were conversations. This is a development. This is a human process guided by the Holy Spirit. So, as scholars and religious educators, we want to maintain that these kinds of things are good for a mature appropriation of one's faith, but they're not always good, sociologically speaking, for things like weekly mass attendance, right? Once people have the sense that things are like juridically optional, even a little bit, right? They're simply less likely to do them. Especially when their religious education and formation has not prepared them to practice an adult faith, but that's a different issue. So of course, in some dioceses recently, right, some local leaders are responding to this fear of like mass becoming optional in people's minds by attempting to take away the options. So in places like Milwaukee, they're trying to remove the dispensation for not attending mass and mandating that everybody get back to the pews, contagion be damned. But of course that doesn't work either, because then essentially what you're telling people is that their lives are simply game pieces in the culture wars, which isn't exactly a compelling reason to stay either. So my sense is that the pandemic, unfortunately, is going to lead to a widespread decline in parish participation that's going to far outlive the pandemic itself. Of course, I think probably the fact that we're all on this call right now probably gives us the impression that we are among those who are really aching to get back to it. But I think for many people, this is going to be an interruption that lasts, which is going to quietly but really radically transform the parish landscape. I see this as one of the biggest challenges facing the parish in the years and decades to come. And it's not just a numbers game. I actually find that participation statistics the least compelling part of discussions on changes in parish life. I think instead of things like the lack of being able to mourn communally, right? Like in 8 months, we've lost 250,000 Americans to COVID-19, which is just stunning, right? That's stunning. And the inability to have traditional funerals and burials and wakes, to gather for Sunday liturgies, and just to hold communally the kind of grief that's accompanied this year, right? We're missing communal singing. We're missing those little moments of ordinary shared parish life together. In my work, in the work that I do elsewhere, I argue that ritual is the language of community. And so when we're unable to practice community, we slowly cease to become one. In ad hoc solutions, your virtual masses, et cetera, are only going to fill the gap for so long. So I think as we look to 2021, the question that we need to take very seriously is, how do we figure out a way in our parishes to practice and to empower real community, whatever that looks like in your parish space? How do we create spaces for the real embodied experience and practice of community? How do we mark this moment in time ritually, right? These momentous griefs, these daily struggles, right? Even the little struggles, right? I was telling, right, when we were just preparing for the call, I have a kindergartner, and I have 3 kids. I have a 5.5-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 1-year-old, all daughters. And my 5-year-old started kindergarten this year, and it's actually gone shockingly as well as it possibly could have. All the schools here are virtual. But just the grief of having to send my earnest little kindergartner to school, like her first real experience of school on an iPad was just that. I was pretty zen throughout the whole pandemic, but that just really, that undid me. So even the big griefs, and then like these small little griefs, how do we mark ritually as a parish, as a community in this period of distance, the real cataclysm that this year has been for so many people, right? And we also have to keep in mind, who are we losing? Whose absences are present with us? Your young family with the newborn babies or medically fragile children, or like mine, toddlers who simply can't stay in their little masking taped off zones, right? We're missing the medically vulnerable, the homebound, elderly. Right now, our in-person masses are by and large exclusive gatherings of the able-bodied, right? And I think we need to keep that in our minds. We need to keep continually before our eyes the ones who are missing, right? We should see those empty spaces in our pews that are masking taped off for social distancing as in fact filled really with the presence of those not there. I think that I personally feel that the lack of community, our felt lack of community is compounded in this historical moment by the lack of really a kind of a unified sense or narrative around the pandemic, around the source of our interruption, right? The politicization of these simple acts of basic respect for the common good, right? You're mask wearing, you're listening to public health advice. It's undermined really in a real way the cause of solidarity. And I suspect that we're going to find whenever the after is to all of this, that in a very real way, the fabric of our parish communities has been eroded somewhat because of the damage done to our sense of the common good over the past year, both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of the politics of disinformation and fear that's been coming from the highest levels of our government. So when I think about parish life in the after, right, I suspect that in many ways, to borrow the words of John Denver, I'm from Denver, so I like to borrow the words of John Denver, we'll be coming home to a place we've never been before. However, right, I think that the parish issues focus on the capacity of parishes to encompass difference and diversity of many kinds as a sort of litmus test of their survival. That point that was made in the issue, I think that still stands, which brings me to my second point. As we know, the pandemic has not affected everyone equally, right? To use a common metaphor, that we may all be in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat, right? The pandemic has disproportionately affected, as we know, Black and Brown communities, the uninsured, the medically precarious, and the poor. Those who can't simply work from home in their slippers, as I am currently doing. And I think that we should hold this reality as well continually before our eyes, particularly as we think about what's next for parish life. Do we see the specific griefs and struggles of particular communities within our parishes? Are these reflected in our prayers of the faithful, in the programs and events that are being planned in our parishes, in the reopening plan, whatever that looks like? Or are we still talking about the poor, about the disabled, about communities of color as someone other than us? And that's something that I also would like to see us keep really front and center as we consider, again, what's next for parish life. So in what can we hope? I'm sure in many ways everything I've just said has sounded very depressing. In what can we hope? In other words, for what are we waiting? Which is a very Advent appropriate question, right? I think, and I'm sure all of you have named this yourselves in different ways. I think the present moment is so complicated because we realize that we aren't going to see a clear borderline between the before and the after of the pandemic, right? I think back in March, many of us thought, I know I thought that churches would close and then one Sunday they would reopen and then we'd all be joyfully reunited, right? Maybe on Easter, particularly since this all started during Lent. I think I had subconsciously bound up Lent and quarantine in my mind. And so then when it was Easter and we were still doing this, I think that really felt like a moment of desolation for me, right? We thought, okay, maybe on Pentecost, maybe in the fall, but now, right, clearly we see that that's not going to be the case. We're going to be in this liminal space for months, maybe years, right? And so the question that raises is what effect does this kind of indeterminate waiting have on our parish communities? And then with that, what might Advent mean for us this year? How can Advent speak to us in a new way this year, particularly surrounding that question of waiting? What does it mean to wait in joyful hope during this period of interminable waiting? I always saw Advent as this sort of exciting, joyful time, right? The kind of waiting where you know the end of the story. Right? We know that Jesus was born, right? It's kind of like when you're a kid and you ask for a bike from Santa, or I guess not, from your parents, let's say, and then you catch a glimpse of it in the attic, so you know you're getting the bike, and you're like, okay, yes. So you're waiting, but you know the end of the story, so you're like, I'm so excited right now. I know what I'm waiting for. I know it's going to come, right? And as Christians, we wait in some way like that, right? We wait as those who know that our longings will be fulfilled, at least eschatologically. But waiting indeterminately is very hard, right? And I think that part of the slow descent into madness that many of us are experiencing right now is because of this indeterminacy. We don't know when the after will come. I think about it a lot in terms of, I remember once, right after I moved to Atlanta, I was in a bad car accident. I'd never been in a car accident ever. I'd never even had a speeding ticket. And then I was in a really bad car accident right after I moved here, and I had to go to the ER. I went on my own, so it wasn't like I was transported in an ambulance. So it was like the ER, but I wasn't a big emergency. So I was just waiting. And I was waiting and waiting and waiting. And of course, in my mind, I was in crisis and it was very urgent, but in the world of triage, I was fine. And I waited and waited and waited. And I think I was finally seen at something like 2 a.m., but not knowing, you have to go to the bathroom, right? You've all been there before, but you don't want to go to the bathroom because what if they call your name while you're in the bathroom? So you're just waiting and waiting and waiting without end. And in some way, that's what this whole COVID-19 quarantine has felt like, just kind of a indeterminate waiting without a clear end. But I think in some way that gives us an insight into a sort of deeper and more sober understanding of Advent hope. It's something that I didn't understand even a little bit until I was pregnant. Like I said, I have 3 girls, but before my oldest was born, I had 3 miscarriages. I lost 3 babies. And then when I finally had my oldest daughter, Nora, she was born in February. So by the time Christmas rolled around and Advent, I was very far along in the pregnancy. And it seemed like, surely I could let my guard down at this point and exhale and it was all going to be okay. I was 8 months pregnant at this point, but there was still this sense of unknowing, right? That experience of loss had in some way robbed me of that freedom to just wait in joyful hope without any fear whatsoever. I felt the weight of not knowing the end of the story. And in some way, that's probably a little bit what Mary would have felt, right? She did not know the end of the story. She did not know how this was going to turn out, even more acutely than anything I or we could possibly imagine. But certainly in those days as well, pregnancy was not a sure thing. It was terrifying, right? You don't know the outcome. And I moved this year. We just set up all of our Christmas decorations. I was moved setting up our manger scene, our creche. It just struck me in a new way this year. I guess the precarity of what it would have been like to give birth in a stable, right, on the outskirts of the outskirts, in the midst of a migratory journey, and then to have to flee right into exile afterward. The precarity of that, the fragility. I'm always floored by the nativity story. The idea that God would become a baby, so fragile, so needy, so soft and humble and sweet and dependent, right? So dependent and so precarious. And the idea of that hope that hangs by a thread, I feel is something that speaks very deeply to my heart this Advent. And in some way, I find myself both craving that sense of joyful waiting, and also being consoled, I guess, by the idea that in some way our faith is that which hangs by a thread, right? The idea that the salvation of all humanity depends on the birth of this tiny, fragile, soft, cheeky little baby. I'll conclude with a poem that I always read to my the classes that I teach at Candler at the end of the fall semester. Our semester actually just ended this past week because they condensed it for COVID reasons. So I still read the poem, but it felt slightly inappropriate because usually you're right on the cusp of Christmas at the end of the semester. But nevertheless, this is my favorite Advent poem, and I think it just now more than ever, it speaks to that sense of quiet hope. That defies in some way all logic. It's called The Risk of Birth. It's by Madeleine L'Engle, who of course famously wrote A Wrinkle in Time. She was also a poet. The Risk of Birth, it's short. She writes, "This is no time for a child to be born, with the earth betrayed by war and hate, and a comet slashing the sky to warn that time runs out and the sun burns late. That was no time for a child to be born in a land in the crushing grip of Rome. Honor and truth were trampled by scorn, yet here did the Savior make his home. When is the time for love to be born? The inn is full on planet Earth, and by a comet the sky is torn, yet love still takes the risk of birth." So with that, perhaps we can open it up for a conversation. I would love to hear about what's happening in your parishes. I can talk about what's happening in my parish and where I'm finding, spaces to practice our faith as a family, and how we're doing that in our home. They just started outdoor mass in the parking lot. We're lucky that we live in Atlanta where it's warm, or warm enough at least to justify that. Probably not so much in Chicago. Yeah, what's happening in your parish? What's on your mind? I'd love to just open it up.
Thank you, Susan. I'm seeing faces and head nods and movement, so I'm really excited for the discussion. If you all wouldn't mind just kind of calling out so we can get unmuted, maybe do a hand raise, or is there not a hand raise function in this piece? Am I missing it, Peter? Shake your head, do something crazy so we call you out and unmute you. Okay, looks like Mary Bast has a question. Thanks, Mary.
Maybe not. I think she was saying hi.
Oh, there you go.
I was just saying hi. I'm sorry. But I love, actually, I mean, now that I'm unmuted, why not? Hi. So I really liked your point, Susan, about the missed communities that are there. It's like the ones that you don't necessarily see, and it was just striking me there that like one of the ways I think, like, because I'm like registered at a parish, but I don't actually, like, I tend to go to different places. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, just around, and just ones that I feel very drawn to, like ones that tend to be a little bit more social justice oriented. My old university has some great stuff and everything, and I think that it really has to, I don't know, it just really strikes me like the people of God as the church. And I think that one of the ways to start is just through those like little individual acts of of kindness or service. I mean, it might sound like super simple, but just something like a smile or inviting someone to church with you, or just finding some type of small thing that you can do, small act of kindness every single day, and you never know what seeds that's going to plant. So just stuff like that, I think, is maybe one way to like do something and make a difference, even in this waiting, like in this season of waiting with Advent. Like maybe that means like calling a shut-in at your parish, or if you're able and you have the capacity to distribute food or something like that. I think those are the place to start for it. So that's what I think. And I'll mute myself now.
Yeah, I love that. My oldest Nora, she had heard with the parish announcement, because they're doing parking lot mass now, that the angel tree, I'm sure you all have that in your parish as well, for St. Vincent de Paul. They did an online sign up this year because of COVID, and that really captured her imagination. And so with me, we went online, and she has some birthday money left over, and she decided to sign up for a couple 5-year-olds gifts, which I think, again, there's just something about this whole period that's just I feel like I'm very kind of tender-hearted right now, where everything just sort of moves me to tears weirdly. And that's something so simple, but it really moved me, her spirit of generosity. And so I hope that becomes an Advent tradition for our family.
That's awesome. We, my family, I'm so excited. So I used to work, or I did like a year of AmeriCorps, which is like basically the domestic version of the Peace Corps here in the States. And I was able to volunteer down at our refugee resettlement place. And I just found out that like Catholic Charities here in our city does like an adopt a family. So it's like just stuff like that, where like you can adopt a family and like give like little gift cards. And I just got my family, so I'm super excited. So just stuff like that is that really does make a difference. And I'm glad that your daughter found that for for her. That's really sweet. So.
Thanks, Mary. Other folks, questions? Just make yourself known via the video and we'll unmute you. I think Alex Gruber, looks like Alex has a question. We can unmute him.
Thanks. So hi, thank you so much for everything, for that wonderful presentation. And I am currently at a college working. It's St. Norbert College in De Pere near Green Bay. Yeah. So Norbertines, and I think An is on the call, a member of the Norbertine Order. And Norbertines take this vow of stabilitas loci, so being like really committed to a certain place. And you mentioned like how today, with that choice element that we have, that I certainly have exercised myself when in different places, sometimes with parishes, how that can really make parishes unstable in a sense, and remove that stability. So do you think there's any way for us to reintroduce this concept of thanks, Miriam. Any way to reintroduce this concept of stability to the church more broadly, of being committed to a certain place where you live, even if the conditions of it aren't always ideal, whether that be like a parish, or sometimes like you're living in a place where you don't see the value at first, or you see yourself just temporarily there like a student or something, but committing to it in a sense, trying to make it better.
I think that's such a great question. I think about stability and locality all the time. And in some way, that's the great paradox of like the present moment in parish life right now, right? Is that canon law defines parishes as stable communities of the faithful. So like geographic stability is one of the hallmarks of what it means to be a parish. So in contrast to like a Protestant congregation where there's more choice and voluntarism involved, there's not this need that, oh, okay, well, I need to go to the closest, whatever Pentecostal church to me. It's where I feel called, where I feel drawn. Maybe I follow a certain pastor, or I like their spirituality or the way they do worship. Catholics are traditionally called to belong to the parish within whose boundaries they reside. And there's a beauty to that, right? It's that sort of, it's like it's like a monasticism for everyone, right? We're called to ground our experience of the incarnation in a place, right? Karl Rahner in the 50s wrote about the parish as the space where the church becomes an event in the sacrament of the Eucharist, most especially, but even in just the ordinary life of the parish. This is where God becomes incarnate in our own backyard. So theoretically, right, we should all be content to go to our local parish, even if it has mediocre music and mediocre homilies and, come what may, or fantastic. I feel like such a pessimist on this call. But right, I know I exercise choice in my choice of parish. Actually, I think I do go to, I don't even know. That's the funny thing. I don't even know if I go to my local parish or not. I think I'm right on the borderline between two parishes. But I go to the parish I go to because it's a Jesuit parish, and because the majority of our Catholic students from Candler go there. It's closer to Candler. I live just a little bit farther out, but I like seeing them there. I like that it's a lot of young families. There was, during ordinary times, there was a family mass at 9:30, which was so loud. It was jam-packed with families. Imagine that, jam-packed. Don't you miss standing shoulder to shoulder with people? And it was practically like an entire cry room because it was so loud, and my kids are so loud, and they weren't even the loudest kids. So obviously that was appealing to me, that somehow my kids would not be the loudest kids in there. So that's why we go there, right? We exercise choice. But I think that there's also a gift in that exercise of choice. But I think that the call to commitment, right, is still there. So if you're going to choose a parish, belong there, right? Go there, ground yourself there. And I think particularly in this day and age where I think as Catholics, we're called to recognize the impact of racial segregation, of cultural encapsulation on our experience of church life. In some way, you can draw an analogy to public schools, right? Why are public schools so segregated? Because they're funded by, property taxes, and because people silo themselves racially, culturally, politically, economically in the places that they choose to live. Right. So analogously, if you're mapping parish boundaries onto residential areas, your parishes quite often are also going to be somewhat racially segregated. And so I know Catholics, when I lived in Boston, I was one of these Catholics who very intentionally chose a parish that was racially and culturally diverse for that reason, because I felt called to belong to a parish community that I felt really imaged the kingdom of God and that challenged me out of my own sort of white Euro-American Catholic comfort zone. But once we committed, right, we belonged there. We grounded our participation in that space. And that community became in some way our community of spiritual accountability. Those were the folks that I envisioned as I wrote my dissertation as a grad student. This is the community that I felt like this is the folks to whom my work is accountable. And so I think that there doesn't have to be the tension between choice and stability, as long as we're willing to make a home for ourselves somewhere. And perhaps I'm just justifying my own desire to keep choosing where I go to mass. But I think also it's important to note too, and I can't remember if I note this in the article or not, but I think much is made of like the parish shopping statistics. A lot of Catholics today, of course, attend a parish that's not their local one. But if you dig deeper into those statistics, like Cara or Pew or whoever did this study, what you see is that a lot of the folks who are choosing to go to a parish that's not their local one are Latinx Catholics, are Asian American Catholics, are Black Catholics. So I think we need to ask the further question of like, it's not just like, oh, people want better homilies and better music. It's who is our parish not serving, right? So if my local parish encompasses, the parish boundaries encompasses a neighborhood that is very diverse, and yet all of the Catholics from that particular area are going somewhere else, right? Maybe it's time to ask ourselves, to whom are we not incorporating, right? Who doesn't feel like they belong here? Yeah, so it's a great question though. It also reminds me just of my home life right now too. The way that you described, committing yourself to a place and living into its particularities, even in their imperfections. I don't know about you all, but after 8 months in my house, I have a lot of home improvement plans. And I have probably spent far too much of my income on small, but in my mind, significant home improvement items. Every day I see a new something in my house that needs to be fixed, which in some way gets to your point, right? Which is like when you really commit to a place and you're there for a long time, you see all of its imperfections. And so instead of like being driven away by the imperfections, you stay and you think, what can I do to address these imperfections? And also, how can I live with these imperfections? Because maybe it's fine that our wall is that ugly color and that our bathroom tile is very ugly because I can't possibly replace it anyway. And if that wall is awkward and empty, but maybe I can just learn to dwell in the imperfection of my home/faith community. That was probably a long, far afield answer, but your question made me think of a lot of things. So it's a good one.
Thank you for that. Okay, I saw a couple hands go up. First, I saw George, and then Greg, I think you'll be next. Sound good? If we could unmute George, please.
Yeah, first of all, just thank you for doing this. This has been fantastic so far. But my question is actually going to kind of continue on the last one a little bit. But you mentioned siloing and kind of, or the parish communities kind of falling under a certain bracket, right? So currently I'm a student at Notre Dame, part of their ECHO graduate service program.
Cool.
Yeah, so no, it's a good time. But for the next 2 years, I'm working at a parish in Jacksonville, Florida. One which it definitely is siloed, right? It's different than my own experience of faith, which is from a more, not necessarily multicultural, but just a different kind of sense of parish community. So in dealing with these imperfections and everything we can talk about like that, what are some ways you can think of to kind of witness to a more vibrant parish setting in my own catechetical ministry?
Gosh, that's such a great question. And I love that you're doing ECHO as well. That's such a good program. I did ACE. So I had a lot of good friends that did ECHO. So I hope you're having a wonderful experience. And what a time, gosh, to be thrown into parish ministry. No, it's a fantastic question. And in many ways, it comes down to, several things. Leadership is very important, as you know. Lay leadership is very important. But I think the folks, and again, this is easier during, regular times. But the sort of folks that you bring in to speak, for example, the voices that you hear, the voices that parishioners hear, the topics that are discussed, the programs that are planned. I think we're formed by what we do, by what we practice. And I think even more than, in catechesis classes and religious education, right? We're formed by sort of the ordinary stuff of our parish experiences, what we see planned in the bulletin, in the prayers of the faithful, and the songs that we sing, in the faces that we see in the pews. It's a sort of implicit formation that kind of forms our imagination about what community is and what we can hope for out of community, and who Catholics are, right? Who God's people are. And I think I'm just thinking about my own formation in parish life, which was very culturally and racially and linguistically and economically siloed. not so much when I was a kid, but I talk about the parish a little bit that I grew up in the article from April. In the beginning, when I was a young kid, it was a little bit different because there weren't that many people. It was sort of on the far edge of Metro Denver development. But as the area became more populated and more suburbanized, the parish very quickly took on this very upper middle class, white, conservative kind of reputation that came to be something that was like safeguarded very closely by the folks with power in that space, and that forms your imagination about like who's Catholic, right? What does it mean to be a U.S. Catholic? I teach a course on American Catholicism, and one of the questions that we sort of explore over the course of the semester is this formation of the idea of American Catholicism and who's an American Catholic, and who's, even today, like in the media or in articles that you read or bishop statements, it's like who's the implicit subject of statements about American Catholics, who are Catholic voters, right? Who get all these sort of like signals and signposts in the media, and you can kind of tell like, okay, well, they don't mean, look, like almost 50% of Catholics are folks who are not white, let's just say. And yet when you talk about like the Catholic vote, clearly you're talking about a very specific subset of American Catholics. Anyway, so I think that's all to say. That was like a long rambling way of saying that our experiences of parish life, I think, form our understandings of who is an American Catholic, who is a Catholic, who gets to speak for the church. And they form us in ways that are very subtle, right? Very insidious, and in ways that are much more impactful than anything that we learn in religious education class. And so I think this isn't in a way, this doesn't answer your question at all, but it instead it sort of reemphasizes how important the question is, that the voices that parishioners hear are very important. The articles or books that they're invited to read for discussion groups, the people that are brought in for parish missions, it's all very important. And I think the more that in parish ministry, particularly in the kind of parish that you're describing, we can normalize diverse voices, racially, culturally, politically, like economically diverse voices, without sort of cloaking them in this aura of controversy, like now for something completely different, someone talking about Black Catholicism. No, this is someone talking about the Catholic Church. Normalizing diverse experiences of the faith, I think, is so critical, because when you're brought up into a very narrow understanding of who gets to call themselves an American Catholic, it ends up deforming your understanding of the church and of God, frankly. And I'm speaking from personal experience here, and it takes a lifetime to unlearn that. So it sounds very, very simple and like a very poor answer to your very good question. But I think I would start with just normalizing a vast diversity of voices. And I think that's, for me, that would be a really important step. I don't think I ever, as a kid growing up in a very, very white, upper middle class parish, I don't think I ever met, actually, I think I know for a fact that I never met an African-American Catholic until I was in college, which is insane, right? Which is crazy. That's wild. How does that not radically deform your ecclesial imagination? So I think that's, for me, that's fundamental. It's basic, but it's so fundamental. It's a great question.
Oh, that helps, actually. Thank you.
Thanks all. And then Greg, I didn't forget about you. I think Greg is up next, if we could unmute him.
Yeah, thank you, Susan, for your presentation and for your responses. I'm coming to you live from Chicago, currently in the MDiv ordination program at Catholic Theological Union. I don't know if my question necessarily bears relevance right now, especially since COVID has been such a game changer, but I will persist in asking. Earlier on in your presentation, you mentioned something about like churches and dioceses in the South kind of seeing this big growth, whereas the infrastructure just can't handle that growth. Whereas in other places in the U.S., you're seeing more like a consolidation or a clustering of parishes and resources. I'm wondering if you've noticed like what's been happening down there. Are there new like methods of evangelization or outreach, or is it just the reality of being in proximity to where a lot of immigrants or other people are coming in? I just wonder what your take is on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of things at play here in the South. The first is the effect of immigration, which is huge. So in the Archdiocese of Atlanta, which is essentially the northern half of Georgia, which has seen some of the most rapid growth in the entire United States in terms of the population of Catholics within the Archdiocese. I think about 50% of Catholics in the Archdiocese are Latinx, for example. So the impact of immigration has been tremendous here. And it's not only Latinx Catholics, Asian Catholics, from the Philippines, from China, from Korea, from all over. I mean, just tons and tons of specific cultural communities that are finding homes here in Atlanta. The thing that's really interesting is because there simply aren't very many parishes, particularly to sustain this kind of growth. What's been happening is the cultivation of sort of these alternative models of ecclesial community. So among Latinx Catholics here, particularly in and around the city of Atlanta, what you have is the establishment over the past 30 years or so of these giant missions. Some of them are missions of particular parishes, and some are sort of their own archdiocesan affiliated thing. But essentially they're giant warehouse churches that take on this pan-Latinx identity. So not all Latinos here in Atlanta are from Mexico. They're from all over Latin and South America. These spaces are really interesting because, I mean, if you compare like Dominican Catholicism to Colombian Catholicism to Mexican Catholicism, it's all radically different things. And so as we talk about Latinx, I know that the mantra of the post-election, like post-mortem has been like, you know, Latinx communities are not a monolith. And that's of course true in the church, perhaps more true in the church than it is even in society at large. And so to have all of these Latinx Catholic communities sort of thrown together into this common massive space is actually its own very interesting and very different model of community. There's tremendous internal diversity there and tremendous sort of intercultural negotiation that happens at every level of those spaces. But I would say those massive pan-cultural missions are something that is kind of a unique feature of Catholicism here in the South. There's a lot of parish sharing, to use Brett Hoover's term again, this idea of the shared parish. There's also, it's really, really, it's a fascinating landscape too, because Catholics have never really been a majority here in the South. And so there's a lot of kind of hybridized or like borderline practice. And so there are folks who go to simultaneously Catholic parishes and also Pentecostal or Protestant communities. It's sort of, they go where they're being served, essentially. They go where they're being welcomed. And so if that's a Catholic community, great. But if it's not, great also. And so the trouble here is, you know, do we have the folks, essentially? Do we have the capacity? Do we have the resources? And frankly, do we have the effort put for, you know, in the kind of relevant formation to welcome these immigrant Catholics, these new faith communities as they come? So there's a lot of different things at stake. I would say I'm not as familiar here. I'm more familiar with the immigrant landscape of places like Atlanta. I'm less familiar with like the new evangelization sort of models and things like that. My sense is that the majority of the growth, and I think the statistics bear this out, the majority of the growth is coming from immigration, and then also like geographical shifts domestically too. So the population, not just the Catholic population, but the population in general of states like Georgia in the South is growing. So I think that that's where you get some of that. But I think the next frontier for the church down here is going to be figuring out how to train lay ministers without sending them to South Bend or Chicago or the Bronx. So Candler's doing some of that work, but in a very small way. Mobile, Spring Hill has a graduate program oriented toward lay ministry. Barry in Florida has a program. But I think figuring out the terrain of Catholic higher ed is going to be the next frontier here, in addition to just building more parishes.
Thank you. You were talking about the community of communities. It reminded me of an experience I had a couple summers ago, and I was at a parish in Los Angeles. The community was largely a Latinx community, but at the same time, there was kind of an attached Korean community there. And I know that several of our guys have made attempts to try and incorporate both communities together, but that's just been something that we've really struggled with. I think even with that model, you have conflicting cultures and communities. The challenge is how do you integrate both together, get the two to communicate and talk to each other.
Precisely, and who and on whose terms does that work take place? I think in a lot of communities like this, you see this sort of sincere but kind of fleeting attempts on the part of English-speaking communities to build community or to welcome or incorporate Spanish-speaking communities, for example, or sort of the non-English-speaking community within the parish. But a lot of that work ends at like having a potluck where we all bring our cultural meals and share together, which is lovely. But when it gets down to questions of resource sharing or space sharing or time sharing, right? When the English speaking masses get the 9, 11 and noon slots, and then the Spanish mass is at like 2:30 in the afternoon when nobody wants to go to mass, like that, to me, that speaks louder than any sort of kind of nice sounding pat expressions of like cultivating diversity or building community. For me, it's like, great, good, good goal. But let's look at your balance sheets. Do you have a English speaking youth minister that you pay a salary, and then a volunteer from the Spanish speaking community who does the same work with the Spanish speaking youth, probably like 4 times as many people for, $0? Do you have like 3 English speaking priests and then like a part-time English speaking deacon that goes around to 5 parishes on a single Sunday? Those sorts of resource issues, the structural stuff, to me speaks louder than words. And I think that those are the sorts of questions that we don't see very many English speaking or kind of shared parish communities that where the power resides with the English speaking community. Those are the kind of conversations that very often are not being had. Is there a parish council made up of 11 English speakers and then like a multicultural concerns representative from the Spanish community that's responsible for voicing the concerns of like the 2/3 majority of the parish who's from the Spanish speaking community, that sort of thing. And so I think it's the question of how to, I would say integrate, but integrate is a tough word too, because you don't want to dissolve those culturally specific spaces. Very, very important, particularly for new immigrant communities, but for all cultural communities, right? People want to worship in their own language. They want to sing in their own language. They want to engage in ministry that's culturally responsive and specific to them. I know at the parish I belong to in Boston, this was a parish that was highly, sort of their whole thing was that they were highly committed to building, intercultural, interracial community between the English and the Spanish speaking communities. And then within the English speaking community, it was about 50% African-American, 50% white. And there really was an extremely robust community that the parish council was integrated. And this is work that had been going on for decades. But even then, right, when it came down to questions of even liturgical practices. So if there was a bilingual liturgical event, there's a way of the cross, a public way of the cross every Good Friday, and there was a story in the history of the parish where the Spanish-speaking community wanted to perform the Passion of Jesus in a much more visceral, sort of pious, traditional way with costumes and a mock crucifixion and someone dressed as Jesus. And the English-speaking community wanted to make it something that was a lot more oriented towards sort of like social justice issues in the neighborhood and speaking out against violence, both of which are very important goals. But, you have here in this like one ritual, you have this sort of competing spiritualities, competing theologies and ecclesiologies, and it's this constant active negotiation. So yeah, the question of how to kind of bridge those boundaries, I think is something that's tremendously important and really, really hard.
Thank you for that, Susan. I don't know if you had a question, but you had a comment in the chat, and I just wanted to open it up in case you did have a question or wanted to add anything. We'd love to add your voice to the conversation. You could just shake your head if you're good.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just make a comment. I said that as a lay Catholic Vietnamese, I also find there's a uniqueness in our own community, especially from our own background, who in generation, depending on where they're at after the war, as they come here, there's a, how you view Catholicism, maybe from the conservative point of view, at the same time is, like very lack the knowledge of social justice, right? We love the church, but we really hinge on a lot on the ritualism, but not so much on the ritual that Susan, you mentioned earlier, that bring community together. Or ritual is the language of community. So for me, is like that is like maybe it's a journey of my own, but I'm just want to share solidarity with who are on that journey in terms of finding your own voice as a lay person. Is like, what can you bring to the church, and what can you build the church in a communal sense? Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. That's so important. I think the generational issue too that you bring up is something that's so critical. I have a Taiwanese student in my American Catholicism class. She's Protestant, but she works with the youth of her congregation, and she has raised some fantastic questions in our course about just the profound differences that you see between generations within migrant communities that themselves form really sometimes really almost insurmountable divides within a single cultural community. The difference between, say, the first and the second generations. Yeah, really, really important to note.
Thank you for that. Milton, I think I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add 2 points. I dropped on the chat the interview we included in that April package of articles with Father Madrigal from Texas, and he does a lot of work with ecclesial integration, and actually his parish has been identified by the USCCB as exhibiting markers or characteristics of high ecclesial integration, not only regarding ethnic, racial integration, but also intergenerational, as Susan was just mentioning. Something as simple as having a younger generation in the parish councils is making a difference. So I dropped it in the chat for you guys. If you haven't checked it out, I think it's worth taking a look at that and following Father Hector's Madrigal's work. The second thing I wanted to also share is there's a book entitled On the Move, A History of the Hispanic Church in the United States by a journalist, actually. He was not he was not a theologian, but he was more so a journalist for a long time, Moises Sandoval, who you may have heard the name before. And he writes, and why I'm bringing this up is because it touches on something that Susan just mentioned. He writes about the 1920s and 1930s, just the hesitation by local bishops their hesitation to bring in Hispanic, Latino devotional practices into the life of the parish because of, quote, the white Anglo Catholic sensibilities, that they didn't want to offend the white American, the white Catholic. And the episodes where he draws this from, it's not like we're talking about Texas. It's not like we're talking about New York City. He's mentioning Texas. He's mentioning New Mexico. He's mentioning Arizona. He's mentioning California. And obviously, we all know that all of these spaces were Mexican up to the middle of the 1800s. So it's that reality of those anti-Latino sentiments have always been part of our community and part of our makeup, especially in the South. But I did want to ask a question. So there were the two things that I wanted to bring up. I did want to ask a question because, Susan, I went to a bunch of World Youth Days, and that was like so exciting to do as a young adult. Having, the liturgy of the hours outside was not a big deal. Having mass outside was not a big deal. When John Paul II came to Toronto, Canada, going up and visiting some of the shrines of martyrs up there, and again, having mass outside was not a big deal. Why can't we figure this out here in the time of COVID? And I want to know more about what that's like down in your neck of the woods. I would imagine a lot more people would attend if it was outside. And gosh, we missed the entire spring, the entire summer, and obviously the fall, and now it's a little bit harder to do up here. But you can just share a little bit more about that experience.
Yeah,
cool.
I love outdoor mass, and it's so funny. My kids love outdoor mass too. They talk about it's so nice to get fresh air. They like talk like they're 50-year-old ladies, but it's so nice to get fresh air during church. But no, our parish finally, after requests upon requests, so many people were requesting it, and finally our parish started outdoor mass about a month and a half ago, maybe. And it's grown every week. And it's such a gift, and gosh, I want it to continue forever. It's wonderful, especially for those. And it's basically the 9:30 mass with all the families, but just in the parking lot. And then also a lot of older adults. You see folks who are, and it was fascinating and really moving that at the first mass, Father Mark, our pastor, at the end, he said, gosh, most of you who are here, I haven't seen you for 6 months. And so it was a real indication that mass was serving people who were not able or willing to go to mass indoors. And so it really is serving a need and helping us to see some of those folks who we're not seeing in the pews right now. I wish it's something that parishes had started sooner, and I wish it was something that all parishes are doing now. I went this summer. We took a long and very 2020 apocalyptic road trip to Colorado to see my family. And we had a little cabin vacation, just my husband and kids, and then we saw my parents. My mom's on this call. My mom, Deborah Bigelow Reynolds. We saw my parents. My dad is he is in a wheelchair and cannot travel, so it felt particularly urgent to see him, since we weren't going to get on a plane, and it felt like the summer was the time that we could have the most flexibility in going. So we took a very, very long road trip from Atlanta to Denver. But anyway, the whole point of the story is that we went for the first time to mass as a family since March. My brother's parish was doing outdoor mass, and it was so nice. And we thought, why the heck aren't we doing this in Georgia? But it was the first time in July that we had all been to mass as a family. And it's so nice. I don't know about you, if any of you all are going to mass indoors. I've only been to mass indoors once since all of this started. The first weekend that they opened up at my parish, I went just by myself. And it felt like that scene in E.T. where everything is draped in plastic and it's so freaky and it's like the apocalypse. I thought I would have this rush of like happiness to be reunited with the Eucharist. And it was so anxiety filled that I was just like, get me out of here. And just so otherworldly. And outdoors, it's such a different, it's very peaceful. And you're right, it's very World Youth Day. It reminds me, I had never been to World Youth Day, but World Youth Day was in Denver when I was 6. And we hosted French and Belgian teenagers, and we went to Mass in Cherry Creek State Park. And I remember it so clearly. It's like one of my earliest clear memories of my life. But yeah, it's very lovely, and feels very kind of organic. And there's a couple that does music now. The one thing we really miss is singing, like really congregationally singing. My husband and I have worked as liturgical musicians, and I miss it so much. The other thing that we did, just to give you all ideas of things that you can do to sustain yourself spiritually along those lines, we're in my daughters are in like a little play group with 2 of our family friends from church. They all have 4-year-olds, and they get together to play several times a week, and they're sort of our pod. And we have started gathering for prayers sometimes on Sunday. This was before they started outdoor Mass. So we had like a little St. Francis Day liturgy of the word, and different things like that. So we've just like gathered in our backyard, and it's felt very hippie, but also, right, the church is the people. So it's really felt lovely. And I think that if I were in charge of everything, which I'm not in charge of anything, I would have spent, well, I don't want to say this because I'm so grateful for everyone who spent so much time and energy and is still doing this thankless work, putting really their lives in danger, health in danger, to broadcast Mass to people. And everybody, especially in those early days, is just doing the best that they can. But I wish that in addition to putting Mass on Zoom, we had also devoted some energy. And I say we, I don't know who would have been doing this, but just the general we of the church would have devoted some energy and some resources to really equipping and empowering families and neighbors and small communities to have home church, to do a liturgy of the word in their living room instead of just turning on the screen. Because I don't know about your kids, if you have kids, but my kids, they didn't understand what they were seeing at all. And they always wanted to play church. And so we just stopped watching Mass online because they just didn't mean anything to them. So they would get a little table, their play table for an altar, and they get to cross off the wall and they get candles down. And we'd have a little procession around the house, and it was so fulfilling for them. And then we'd read the readings, and then my daughter would go, okay, now do a homily. And then we'd talk about the readings and have the questions and what did you notice? And she would always go, I love homilies. I was like, said no one ever. But it ended up being something that was really spiritually profound. And ironically, it ended up being this time of great spiritual growth for our family. Just to share this time together, and it was really enriching for our kids. And I think that Catholics in general, kind of because of the built-in clericalism, even in the most neutral sense of the word, in terms of our practice, our liturgical practice, our understanding of prayer in the church, it's, we're not used to taking ownership of that. We're not used to leading that. And I wish that more Catholics felt empowered really to lead prayer, right? To be the domestic church, right? To lead prayer with their families. Because I think that people feel self-conscious about that. They don't know what to do. Am I doing it right? Where do I find the readings? Where do I find the prayers? I think that's something that I would like to see a greater emphasis on coming out of parishes, is equipping families to lead prayer within their own homes.
Thank you for that, Susan. I'm checking the time. I noticed a couple people are dropping off. It's dinner time. It's only Monday, day like 3,000 of the pandemic. We have a prayer to kind of close us out, but I just wanted to make sure if there were other questions, any other thoughts, we love having this sort of engagement. This is really encouraging and fun to witness. Anybody else? No, right. Bueller, nothing. Well, thank you so much, Susan. This was really wonderful, and it's lovely to see so many new faces join our Weal calls. Just to, an epic teaser for the new year. We are really in conversation. Well, I'll backtrack a little bit. When the pandemic started in March, we sort of haphazardly put these together almost every week. I think every week we had them from March through most of May, maybe some of June. And it was a lot of fun, and we had quite a bit of engagement. We sort of tapered off with the summer as schedules changed and all that, but going into another, what is sure to be cold winter, at least here in Chicago, we're looking at making weekly programming again. So we hope that you all will continue to stay engaged. And thank you to Peter and the Bernardine Center folks for handling so much of the communication. And of course, our friends at Commonweal, we really appreciate all of your efforts. And with that, I will, unless I've forgotten something, Peter or Darius, I will hand off to Darius. I've guilted Darius into doing our closing prayer because I think he has a better prayer voice than I do. Thank you again, Susan.
Thanks so much, Mariam, and thanks again, Susan. This was really wonderful conversation. I feel like there's room for a part 2 somewhere in the near future, so don't be surprised if we reach out for that. I'll share this prayer. There's a link to it in the chat. Sorry if the link is a little long, but we are entering into a very different kind of Thanksgiving, and so this prayer really encapsulated for me a lot of what I was feeling and thinking, and I hope it resonates with you as well. So we begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. A Thanksgiving prayer in time of pandemic. On this Thanksgiving day like no other, even now, O God, your name is worthy to be praised. For in your mercy and kindness, no thought of ours is left unguarded, no tear unheeded, and no joy unnoticed. For the blessing we have known, and for those we have yet to recognize, to you we give our grateful thanks. For life that reminds us how fragile we are, and also how strong we can be, we thank you, O God. For sheltering that urges us to rediscover what truly matters, we thank you, O God. For communication that allows us to connect in ways new and old, we thank you, O God. And for mindfulness that shows us how much we rely on one another, we thank you, O God. Watch over your family, Lord, gathered here and at tables separated by miles, and bless those who work tirelessly to keep us all safe. Though we may be kept apart on this day that calls us together, we know your Spirit draws us close. Lord, we ask you to ease the pain of empty chairs that bring to mind our beloved dead. Let our grieving find its rest in your Son, Jesus, in whose resurrection is our hope. Grant your Spirit to be present here, that this meal, our meals, may become a foretaste of your heavenly table, where every tear shall be wiped away, every hunger fed, and no distance can separate us from your love in Christ, for whom all good things come. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Darius. The truth is I couldn't get through that without tearing up, so that's why I had to hand off. Sorry. Well, thank you again, everyone. We really appreciate your time, and we hope we see you again in the coming weeks. Everyone have a blessed and safe Thanksgiving, and we look forward to connecting with you soon. Thank you.